Well, hello, friends. It is Between Two Sundays, and Mark Beresford and I are here to share with you about the stuff. No, about the readings that have happened from last time, the ones we're going to in this Sunday. We're doing it between the two Sundays because what a better place to contemplate those things. Hello, Mark.
Hello, Mark. How are you?
A
Another
little,
fine,
a
fine
little,
introduction.
a little tired and weary, obviously, but we'll we will get there.
Yeah, join
Uh,
the club.
As mentioned speedily in the introduction, of course, Between Two Sundays is the time when Mark and I gather between two Sundays and we have a conversation about how we lived out of the readings that have just gone and how we live into the readings that are coming up in the week that's coming up. And we do this together and we have a great time doing it, and we talk about stuff and we often finish and go, whoa, that was really, really cool. And I guess we just simply do that because we love it. And this is your invitation to join us and be a fly on the wall during the conversation.
Yeah,
And then to participate in it by contacting us through the different means that we'll talk about a bit later in the show. But I think
pretty
I just wanted
simple
to,
little format.
yeah, and I just wanted to throw that little bit in because it's not like we're doing this to try and be grandiose, and we're not doing this to try and um, hey, we're the guru guys on the lectionary readings or anything like that. We're doing this because Mark and I have had conversations like this for decades now.
Yeah,
And we just thought it'd be fun to work through the lectionary and have these conversations and record them for posterity. And if there was someone out there who happened to find some value in it, well, great. And as it turns out, a few people have, so that's nice, but
yeah,
certainly not why um, we're doing these things.
of course.
So, of course, in our little, and just excuse me for a moment while I bring up last week's readings, because I've lost my notes from last week. Uh, our format is, of course, to first of all discuss the readings that we lived out of from the Sunday that has just gone. And of course, the readings that we're doing are from the Revised Common Lectionary, which are common through most of the denominations, particularly the liturgical churches. So if you go to a Lutheran,
Yeah,
Anglican, Episcopal, Catholic church, you're likely to use them. A lot of uniting churches, Methodist churches,
yeah.
Presbyterian churches use the lectionary.
Even
And
some Baptist churches use it.
absolutely. And there are some other lectionaries too. I know a couple of Lutheran churches use one that's slightly different, which is very, very cool. We're just using the traditional lectionary, which works through the scriptures in a 3-year series over every Sunday. And of course, the readings from last week were from Jeremiah 4, from Psalm 14, 1 Timothy chapter 1, verses 12 to 17, and Luke 15, verses 1 to 10. And I don't know, mate, was there something that really stuck home or stayed home in your heart and that you've been carrying since our conversation a week ago?
There were a few things that actually stayed with me, but the one I want to highlight is Paul's description of Jesus' interaction with him as displaying the utmost patience. At least in my mind, I'm always thinking of the life, death, and resurrection of Jesus displaying humility. I'm always thinking of it displaying service to us. I'm always thinking of it displaying compassion. But patience, I guess that's not a new thought, obviously, but it's at the same time to think that that's what Paul believes Christ is displaying in Christ's putting up with him for so long, with his ignorance, with his lack of understanding of the heart of God. Even while he was a religious guru, a religious up-and-comer in the Jewish world. Paul now looks back and sees all the things that have occurred in his life as displaying the patience of God. I love this because I think it flips things upside down for us again, as a lot of our encounters with Jesus do. If this is the enfleshment of God or the incarnation of God, Jesus is behaving very differently to the way we would expect God to behave. If we believe God is in the system of the kingdoms of this world, and this extraordinary patience that Paul names here, I think it's a beautiful thought that at the heart of the universe is one who is patient, not losing patience like we tend to, even around things like salvation. But God is always patiently, quietly, humbly, in an act of service, working behind the scenes for us and for our world. I think this is one of those pictures that should surprise us about God and remind us to be people doing the humble, small, patient things in our world rather than always going for the big things.
That's a really interesting thought, because if one believes that God is the force, the energy, the life that holds all things together and by which all things exist, and if God is very much visible in the world around us, as we both believe, then patience is a message that we see every single day.
Yes.
Nature doesn't rush.
No, it certainly doesn't.
We do. We try and force. And it's interesting, Paula and I have been talking about this a lot of late as we prepare to grow our own vegetables at our new place. You go to the supermarket and you can pretty much buy any fruit and vegetable almost that you like, as long as you're willing to pay the price at any time of the year.
Yes.
Because we as humans are impatient and we don't want to wait for mango season. We don't want to wait for broccoli season. We don't want to wait for whatever. We want it all year long, every day.
Yeah.
And of course, in going to grow our own, that's not going to work. And we've been reminding ourselves that not only do we have to think about what we're planting, but throughout the course of a year, there are going to be things that we miss and will not be able to have because they just don't grow then.
Yeah.
But nature doesn't moan about that. Humans do. The rest of the created world does not. And so patience really is a lesson that sits at the heart of who God is and how God has made the world around us. But for whatever reason, we push against the goads of all the time. There's something very, very comforting about that reminder to be patient.
I wonder if this is. I wonder if this is one of the messages that we in the church had all the potential to hear from the scientists who declare an old Earth. So even the process of creation is a very, requires quite extraordinary patience on the part of the Creator, surely. We've well, not myself, but there's plenty of people in the church who spend a lot of time arguing against an old Earth type of approach to understanding the world. I wonder if, a little bit of humility might have listened and actually heard something of the patient heart of God in that understanding of how the world has come to be.
Yeah, that's powerful. That's a really, really good thought. Yeah, never made that connection, actually. It's a good connection. You take the Genesis account literally, 6 days and it's done. Then that's going to make you think you just snap your fingers and voila. Of course, that's not the way the world works. It's not the way it even works in the course of things as we watch them now. And I think the stories of Scripture, if we take them to heart, we can see a God who works in God's time and is very patient.
Yeah. Yeah.
And it should move us to do the same.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. The Paul conversion was something that I had stiff, but it's interesting that it stuck because of those two parables that we read in Luke's gospel, the parable of the lost sheep and the parable of the lost coin. Because in both of those stories, if you remember from our conversation, we talked about how the action is completely on the one who owns.
Yes.
And in Paul's conversion story, we see exactly the same thing. We don't see a Paul who's inquiring or seeking or anything like that. This God just rocks up to Paul and says, "Hey, here I am." And it made me think, or it reminded me to sit there and contemplate and dwell on the fact that our connection to God has absolutely no bearing on us. When we talk about there's nothing you to do to make God love you more, nothing you can do to make God love you less, it literally is there's nothing you can do. It just is. And unfortunately, talking about messages of the church over time, just like the patience thing, it's not a message that the church has been good at communicating. In fact, you would think that the church was communicating something completely different, that you have to do this and do that and jump through this hoop and take this catechism class and go to this thing, and make this confession and stand here and be baptized this or baptized that or whatever. And then you're a part of everything. And we see in Paul, God rocking up to Paul and saying, "Hey, we're a thing.
Yeah.
Get with it." Which Paul had the right to go, "Nah," or "Yep." But it's certainly not because God had rejected Paul in any way, shape, or form, or that Paul was rejected by God. So it's an interesting reminder. And that one little point about in each of the cases, and including the lost son as well, which is the third parable in that set, which wasn't a part of the readings, that when something's lost, it means it's belonged to someone before that. So when we talk about the lost, why are they lost? They're lost because they're already owned by someone or something. They already belong to someone or something. They're not lost because they are estranged from that person. They're lost because that thing or person can't find them. So again, that action is completely from the heart of this God who wants us to know that we are connected. And so, there was a long time dwelling on those things and reflecting on what that means for not just me, but what that means for how I see people particularly, but also the world around me. If we believe that the work of Jesus in the world was to reconcile all things, then all things have been reconciled. That's the bottom line.
Yeah.
And Paul's story is evidence from his own experience, mind, but that's fair enough. That's his own experience of having that happen for him. And of course, it's not the only one in history of people who would share that. And it's not the only one in history that would be, and there would be others rather in history that would come from outside of the Christian fold as well. Stories of many people who have heard the voice of God and responded to that, which is incredibly powerful, that there is this benevolent force in the universe, however you want to name it or understand it, that longingly seeks for us to be reconciled, which perhaps is part of that oneness that Jesus prays for in John chapter 17.
John,
yeah.
Very nice, very nice.
Anywho, that was the 14th Sunday. We are now into the 15th Sunday after Pentecost coming up this week. And our readings for this week come from Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 18 to 9, verse 1, Psalm 79, verses 1 to 9, 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 to 7, and Luke 16, verses 1 to 13. Anything take your fancy where you want to kick off?
What about let's start at the Old Testament again.
All right, let's start with Jeremiah.
We've done that often.
Yeah.
And here's my initial thoughts on this passage.
Right.
So here we have Jeremiah the prophet, known as the weeping prophet, probably specifically around passages like this.
Yeah.
Here we have him lacking joy, filled with grief. His heart is sick. He's hurt. He mourns. Dismay has taken hold of me. All around the way his people are behaving, and how his people are being treated as well by the armies around him. And I really value Jeremiah. I love his. I kind of, in some ways, actually relate to his sadness, to his response to the world around him, of mourning. And this passage left me asking, what is the value of this? What's the inherent value of Jeremiah responding this way? What's the inherent value of his tears? I don't know that I have a complete answer to it. But what if the prophet's tears are part of his prophecy, as they clearly are here? And what if that means he's reflecting the heart of God as he mourns, as he goes through this world, burdened by the results of people's behaviour? And I just found myself thinking that this is not so much about Jeremiah's tears as the thought that Jeremiah reflects God's tears, that God aligns God's self with so much with the poor and downtrodden, as my particular version describes over and over, my poor people. It just seems to me that maybe Jeremiah's tears are reflecting the very heart of God, which is his job as a prophet, to speak the words of God, to speak the heart of God into the world.
Yeah. That word comfort is an interesting one.
Yes.
Because it has a multitude of different meanings. The word is mabelgeth in Hebrew, and some scholars say it's uncertain exactly what it means, but comforter is a good one, but for a more fuller understanding, source of cheerfulness or brightening is an understanding of the word. So it's not just a God who gets alongside and, oh, poor, I'm here. Yeah. It's also a God who wants to bring light and life back. So obviously, and you pick up really well, this weeping prophet has this sense of downcastness and is seeking for God to bring cheerfulness and brightness back. That's the comfort he's seeking, not just this this God who's going to be understanding and empathetic, but one who's going to instill life and vibrancy back into his heart.
Yes.
And it's interesting too that if you look through verses 19 and 20, there seem to be three things that are weighing down on him that the Israelites are saying that demonstrates why God's what's the best way to put it? It demonstrates why God seems absent to them. So the first one there is the Lord not in Zion? Is her king no longer there? So there was this sense of Zion almost being worshipped, that the center of Jewish light and life was here in this one place. And so in their focusing on that over God, there's this missing of the point, which seems to not have been picked up by the people. And then there is this, why have they provoked me to anger with their images, with their worthless foreign idols? So not only are they seeking solace in place, a particular place and space, being Zion, they're also grabbing onto whatever they can in terms of idols, both local and foreign, to try and bring themselves some sort of connection to the divine that way. And then the third one says the harvest is past and the harvest is past and the summer has ended and we are not saved. So there was also this petition to the seasons that once we have brought the harvest in, we'll find joy and happiness and whatever in our prosperity. So they're looking to Jerusalem and they're missing it. They're still clinging to the old ideas and the old ways and missing it. They're still hedging their bets on having a bumper harvest and that will make us happy, and they're missing it. And so out of that, God says in that first part of chapter 9, verse 1, oh, that my head were a spring of water and my eyes a fountain of tears, and I would weep day and night for the slain of my people. So there's this sense of God saying, look, you're trying to hedge it on a place, you're trying to hedge it on other idols, you're trying to hedge it on your prosperity. You're looking everywhere except to me, to God, to the source of all those things. And it's a really interesting passage to read in the context of today and the day in which we live, and the way a lot of people live their lives trying to find their joy and their happiness in a certain place and space. If only I could live there, if only I could live here. There's nothing wrong with going to places where you're going to feel you're connected and where you'll be able to live in a way that brings you joy. But if you're hedging all your bets on that, there's an issue. Same with idols. Think of all the idols we put around ourselves, our doodads and gadgets, I need a new car, I need a new phone, I need a new this, that, or the other. We've surrounded ourselves with idols and we're wondering, why aren't we happy? And likewise too, in our prosperity. If I can have more money, a bigger job, more followers, more likes on my posts on social media, then I'll be a happy camper. But we haven't found it there. And so we have this emptiness and this sorrow. And yet God is saying here in this passage, the very thing that can bring light and life and vibrancy to you is the one thing you keep missing. And so in terms of this day and age, I don't think Jeremiah's message has gone astray. I think it's stuck so well, which interesting of a lot of not just scripture, but a lot of very early writings around the church and so on. There's a timelessness to this that I think in this day and age today is incredibly powerful and speaks volumes to us and to what we should be, or how we should be living, and what we should be placing our source of joy in.
Yeah, this so we've seen this, this passage comes Jeremiah 8. We actually see this as early as Jeremiah 2, I think it is. My people have committed 2 sins. They've denied the spring of the fountain of water, and they've gone off to dig cisterns, broken cisterns that hold no water. It's a picture of idolatry, and the madness of it, of course, the poor substituting that idolatry is. But you're absolutely right. This is something that we seem to habitually do as people, which of course has caused many people to suggest that inherently as people, we are drawn to worship. It's not that Christians worship God and everyone else doesn't. It's that we all worship. It's just a question of what and where. And just like in that Jeremiah 2, we're all seeking water. It's just a matter of where. It's just a matter of how. So this is a question of the idolatry question is really not a question of whether we have idols. It's who are we putting in that place of worship, and the lack of good decisions on the part of the people Jeremiah speaks to cause him to weep. In this way, in this passage.
It's interesting that the psalm speaks very strongly to that sense of, all these things that we've placed as a part of importance in life. Obviously, it's being written around a time where the other nations are invading Israel again and desecrating the temple, killing off Israelites, so on. And they see this, and I say it like that just as a slight aside here, because we've got to remember that what we hear recorded in Scripture is often people making sense of what's going on around them. And particularly, when we have this narrative story that arcs the whole from beginning to end in the Hebrew Scriptures, what we're seeing is different generations making sense of things that have happened, not just for them, but also in times before, and have understood them in new ways, which is why we literally do see the understanding of God changing from Genesis 12 all the way through the arc of the story. And then in the prophets, which get very specific around many of those events and places and times and things, we literally see the understanding of God transforming from very primitive, basic understanding from where those myths and stories of the first part of Genesis come from, which are very similar to other nations around them at the time, right through to an understanding that is about justice and love and standing up for right. A lot of people say, well, you got this God of, like the God that's described here in Psalm 79, we have all this stuff that's happening to us. And then verse 5, how long, O Lord, will you be angry? How long will your jealousy burn like fire? Pour out your wrath on the nations, not on us. So basically they're blaming God for what's happening to them, and saying, can you please direct your anger out there, and everybody else is doing this to us, and what's going on, which is why they go on to say, help us, God, for the glory of your name, deliver us and forgive us our sins for your name's sake. Obviously, they're seeing something has upset this God, hence why they're being attacked. And so they're putting it down to the fact that, well, we need to appease this God. Let's ask for forgiveness. What's incredibly interesting about this psalm when you read it alongside the Jeremiah passage is once again, you can see that it seems that people that are being described in Psalm 79 are putting their energies, efforts, and focus on the wrong things. It's about, the nation of your inheritance. So it's about their nationhood. It's about the temple. It's about, all these things that, the stuff that is not going to bring them happiness. This is the stuff that seems to be affected. And you might wonder, well, if, not saying that this is why it happened, but if there was a God who was knocking out everything that seemed to have been at the center of what you were on about, there's two ways you could think about it. One is you could think about it like this, that God's trying to, get our attention and we've done something wrong. Or maybe it's a case of, is God knocking it out of the picture because it doesn't need to be in the picture? So these things that we have lifted up as being central to who we are and what we are about, maybe what should be happening is that if this God just keeps knocking these things out of the way, maybe, just maybe, we're putting our efforts and energies in the wrong thing. And if you think about, when everything's stripped back, what's left? God.
Yeah.
And again, I'm all for things, activities, practices that help us feel connected to God. But those things are not the means and ends in and of themselves. They are things that bring us into a place where we're ready for that, where we can put ourselves to focusing on the thing that we're there for, and that is God. So there's a real interesting message coming through these two passages from the Hebrew text, which again, in our modern world, should lend them to have us contemplate very seriously, what are we surrounding ourselves with? And is that literally forest are they literally trees that are not allowing us to see the forest that we should be focusing on?
I was really interested in the juxtaposition between towards the end of this passage. There's a calling, pour out your anger on the nations that do not know you and the kingdoms that do not call on your name. So there's this calling for wrath, the wrath of God to come down. And in the very next breath, really, do not remember against us the iniquities of our ancestors. Let your compassion come speedily to meet us. I read this, and I have two responses to it. The first is, isn't that just like me? And the second is, isn't that totally unlike Christ? This wanting to get at the enemy is so un-Christ-like. And I'm not expecting the psalmist to understand what Christ is, but as you say, there's a building up of this story, and there's a pinnacle to this story that we call the story of God. And it is Jesus, the light of the world, coming in and showing us that we all get it wrong, and God has compassion on all of us.
Yeah.
And here you've got the psalmist saying, they get it more wrong than me, and you should be wrathful against them, and you should be compassionate against me, which is so typically us. Yet God, if you take Jesus seriously, is bigger and above this. This love of enemies, this giving of self for enemies, this humility suffers on the part of those that are opposed to God, it just doesn't come to us this easily. And so I think the psalmist, this is a classic psalm that really tells us that the picture of God is not complete here. And for me is always pulling me towards the most accurate picture we have of God, which is the person of Jesus.
Yeah, I mean, we mustn't kid ourselves. It's not as if the Hebrew scriptures are devoid, even in the early parts, of the sort of God that Jesus promoted. I mean, right there in Genesis 12, that call of Abraham concludes with, I'll make you a great nation and you will be a blessing and all the other nations will be blessed through you, which this psalm is the complete opposite of. This psalm that says, smash everybody else, but forgive us and, be with us. But it's a really interesting point that how like us does this tend to be, and how unlike who we really are that attitude is.
Certainly just a cursory glance of church history makes us very conscious of this as well. It's not that we have to go back to ancient Jewish history to find this kind of thing. This is the reason these psalms continue to ring true to us is because we see ourselves in them.
Yes.
And I certainly am not beyond seeing myself in this juxtaposition that this psalmist describes. So I think that human element of the Psalms is often very insightful about our divided nature. Part of us wants to be like God, and part of us is vehemently opposed to God, or part of us understands God, and part of us is very ignorant of God. So we find ourselves torn in different directions, and I think this ultimately is what's happening here. He wants compassion for himself and wrath for others, but I know we've all done wrong, but have compassion for me. And it's I actually really like that the Jewish prayer book teaches people to pray this way, to pray this honestly.
Yes.
I don't think they're saying this prayer is exactly what God wants, but I think they're giving language to the human experience of they've done the wrong thing and I'm suffering. So take them out and have compassion on me.
Which I would say that perhaps the hope is that in reading these prayers, people do exactly what we're doing now and going, oh yeah, that doesn't sound so good on paper, but
exactly,
I do it all the time.
Yeah.
It's interesting too. This is again slightly off the scriptures themselves that we're reflecting on, but I just sort of realized that at the time of the writing of this psalm, it's highly unlikely that there would have been collected writings of the other parts of the Hebrew text. Now, they would have come together and been written down around the time of the Babylonian exile, we believe. These psalms would have been written before that and recorded somewhere. And not a part of that as a whole. So you've got to ask the question, no doubt people are telling the stories. There's no doubt about that, because that's how they come to be written down and collected together. But it's unfair to say, well, if this is how they're praying and this is how they're living, why don't they know their own scriptures? This would be like, remember that story, you read when you were 5.5, and it went like this, and you go, oh yeah, okay. But in everyday life, we don't think of it, even though its lessons, are there in the story. It's not that it comes up all the time whenever we have this sort of thing happen in our lives. So to be fair to these people, the reaction that they're reacting with here is very, very human, very, very normal
Yes.
in the sense that this is the way humans often
Yeah.
live this out. And while it's contrary to that call of Abraham in Genesis, um, to say, well, these guys should have known better is a little bit unfair.
Mm.
Although you would also like to think that in writing this down, this was really good therapy for the psalmist Asaph, who wrote
Yeah.
this psalm. Because in writing it down, I'm sure Asaph read it back and went, like we just said before, it doesn't look so good on paper.
Yeah.
I know this is how I'm feeling. And I guess that's the other thing too. We shouldn't be afraid to really pour ourselves out before God, like Jeremiah did.
Yeah.
And like this psalmist does. God's not going to
I
be.
think that's the deep message here, Mark. The
Hmm.
deep message of the Psalms is, even if your understanding of God is inadequate or small or shrunken down by your circumstances, you can bring who you are in the moment to God.
Yes.
And I think that's what the Psalms teach us. They actually give us words to do that, rather than affirm all of our emotions as being godlike, or all of our theologies even as being godlike, accurate depictions of God. I don't think that's the case. And I don't think that's our relationship with God is dependent on us getting all that right. And the Psalms are a beautiful, beautiful example of that. And this is one of them. This is one of them where the contradictions kind of rise to the surface as this person prays, and the prayer is completely acceptable to God. In fact, we want people, the writers, the collectors of these prayers are actually saying we want people to be able to pray like this. We want them to pray in their inadequacies rather than just give them right answers about God. None of us are there. We all have to pray this way. And all of our prayers, I mean, who hasn't prayed and then said, God, I know I shouldn't say that. I think that's what the Psalms are actually pointing to. The possibility that every human emotion and experience should be brought to God as it is, and watch what God does with it.
Yeah.
But don't squash it down. Don't crush it down because it's not theologically correct. My experience or my emotions aren't what God would want me to experience. Actually, bring that gap to God rather than try to hide it from God.
Which actually lends itself also to having an interesting conversation about what prayer is. Psalms like this are an interesting trigger. Well, if we're saying that these are prayers, then what does that say about the nature of prayer? I think the problem we have is that people look at Psalms like this and go, they are praying that someone else gets smashed and they are the people of God. This is the sort of thinking that turns people, rightfully so, because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding Christians who see it the same way and will communicate it like that. This is why a lot of people say, your God is horrendous. Your God's horrible. You pray Psalms like this, and this God does it, But if the nature of prayer isn't so much for us to tell God what to do, and ask God to do it for us. But instead, if the nature of prayer is to simply lay ourselves bare before God, then this is a really good example of a prayer that looks like that. Where if prayer is about us sitting before God and God going, spill it.
Yeah.
What are you feeling? What's going on in your head? What's going on in your life? Spill it. Yeah. If that's what prayer, part of what prayer is, and this is why a lot of people misunderstand silent prayer. I've had people say to me, you sit in silence in prayer, what a waste. Mother Teresa, and this is not mainline Christians saying this. This is Christians. What a waste. You
Yeah.
know, you should be asking God, you should be petitioning God for this, that, and the other. And I love what Mother Teresa said to a journalist once who said, do you
Mm.
pray? Yes. Well, what do you say? She said, not much, I just listen. She said, what does God say? She says, not much, he just listens. Which I think is beautiful. Because
Yeah,
once
that's
again,
good.
what
That's
is
good.
prayer? It's about being in the presence of someone you love.
Yeah.
I don't sit in front of my wife and I go, can you make me dinner? Can you make me this? Can you do this and do that?
Yeah.
We sit with each other and we are with each other, and
Mm,
it's worded
cool.
and it's wordless, uh, and we share each other how we're feeling.
Mm,
That's what prayer is. It's sitting with a loved one and bearing and sharing your life with them, despite the
mm,
fact that they probably already are aware of what's going on.
yeah.
Which raises the question: perhaps prayer is more for us than it is about who we pray for per se.
Yeah.
Um,
Which is interesting when you get to the Sermon on the Mount and you see Jesus insist that God knows your needs before you ask. And I mean, how many people have read that and said to themselves, clearly prayer doesn't, what's the function of prayer then? That is a question coming entirely from this request understanding of prayer. But Jesus says that and then goes on to teach them how to pray. And Jesus says that and then goes on and prays to the Father himself. Clearly, this is not a reason, if you're to take the life of Christ consistently, as a consistent life. This is not a reason not to pray. In fact, Jesus is putting it forward as a reason to pray.
Yes.
So clearly, it's not about changing God's mind. It's about changing ours.
Yeah, that's exactly right. That's exactly right. Let's jump into the gospel reading and the reading from Timothy, because as has been noted in weeks previous, these two kind of go together again in an interesting way. And this is a really interesting parable, and I reckon it's probably one of the most misunderstood parables. The parable of the shrewd manager, which of course is about that manager who's told by the rich guy that he works for, I want you to give an account because there's some accusations that you're, not being a good steward with my money.
Yeah.
And so the guy goes, great, I'm about to lose my job. What am I going to do? So he goes out to all the debtors who owe the rich man that he works for money, which would normally be his job to go in and say, where is it? Hand it over. He goes into them and says, what do you owe? And he says, 1,400. He says, okay, look, give me half. Give me half, and we'll call it done.
Yeah.
And he does this because, according to the story that Jesus is telling, he does this because he wants to have favor with people, because when he's out of a job, he's going to need to find a job. And he wants to be known as a favorable person so that hopefully someone out there is going to offer him a job. And when the rich man finds out about this, he doesn't chastise the manager. He actually commends him for what he's done.
Yes.
And calls him shrewd. Now, interestingly, I think in the modern world, we understand this thing shrewd as something that's a negative. We think of somebody who's being conniving and, carefully, manipulating things to their advantage. But the word shrewd, just from an English definition, literally means to show sharp powers of judgment.
Yeah.
So shrewdness is something that allows you to look at the scene and work out what you're going to do to move forward from there. The word that's translated as shrewd, or in other versions actually more closer to the truth of this word wise, is phromenos, which means sensible, prudent, and demonstrating wisdom. So this is truly a commendation that's given to this guy in the affirmative. How affirmative? Well, Jesus then goes on to say that the disciples should do the same,
Mm,
that they literally should be wise and sensible and prudent and shrewd in the true sense of the word, to have favor with the people who are around them. He says, I tell you, use worldly wealth to gain friends for yourselves, so that when it's done, you'll be welcomed into eternal dwellings.
mm,
So this is about, and by the way, eternal dwellings there, again, that word eternal, aeon, is talking about fullness and vibrance of life. And so what you have here is an interesting parable in which Jesus is literally saying, do what you can to maintain good connection and community with people around you who uh, so that you can have favor with them.
mm,
Now, the question we need to ask ourselves is, why would Jesus want that? And there's two things that come up. Straight after that, he says that in verse 9. The first thing he goes into talking about is the person who is trusted with much can be, the person who, trusted with much. I'm going to get this confused. Whoever, I'll just read it straight there. Whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. There we go.
yep,
And
yep.
whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. So if you have not been trustworthy in handling worldly riches, who will trust you with true riches? So basically what Jesus is saying here is that demonstrate that you can use what little you've got, and he's not just talking about money, but use what little you've got to invest it wisely, and you will have more to invest wisely. Now, I know the prosperity teachers have used this to say, invest your little bit into the kingdom and God's going to give you more money to keep investing into the kingdom. But he's not talking about money here. Then he goes on to talking about serving two masters. He will hate one and love the other. You cannot serve both God and money. But in the text, the word money isn't used. The word mammon is.
So I've got, you cannot serve God and wealth.
Yeah. So, I mean, I'll pull up in a minute what the defining word of that thing is there. But the idea is about serving two masters. And so you've got these resources around you. And the question is, are you going to use them to serve God and love others? Or are you going to use them for yourself?
Yeah.
So it's a really interesting parable, because literally Jesus is saying, be like this manager. Be like this manager, which is...
As I read this parable, I find myself wondering if the rich man is learning from his manager.
Yeah.
Or if the rich man is seeing in his manager something he already knows.
Okay. Yeah.
That he is, that, you know, I know this is wise. This is how I invest my money as well. I don't know. I don't have the answer to that, and I don't think it's clear. Again, I love the interaction between the different ways to invest. So clearly, this rich man has loaned his wealth in order to get more. So he's loaned his mammon, or his wealth, in order that he would get more wealth. So money begets money. But in some ways, Jesus is flipping that and trying to put love into the equation, not saying money is bad, but where are you investing it? Are you just investing it to get more? Or are you investing it to bring yourself into relationship with others? And it's only at the point that this manager thinks, I'm going to have no more income, that he can see this as wise, that he can see this as the path forward. At that point, he says, actually, you know, the job's not worth anything anymore. I'm not going to make any more money out of this relationship, I suppose he's saying. Here's how I'll act so that I will have friends, so that I will have relationship rather than just the money. And this is a change for him too, I think. It's a change at this point that he realizes there's no more regular income here. I'm going to have to behave differently towards those I've previously just seen as a way to get money for my master.
Yeah.
So there's this interaction between, and I think we see this in real life too. There's this interaction between money and investment in more money, or money and investment in people. In the hope here that this manager, when he has no source of money, will actually have friends. So when he has no money to invest in money, he actually wants to have friends at that point. He wants to have relationships. So this is all a highlighting of what's worth investing in.
Yes.
What's investment look like in this kingdom? And I think we get stuck in this parable by saying, wise investment means money makes money. That's what wise investment means. But Jesus is actually saying the opposite here. He's saying, actually, wise investment will be money making friends. We'll be using whatever you have to invite people into relationship.
Yeah.
And he's insisting, by the end of it, you can't serve both.
No,
and that just can't do it.
That word mammon that I was talking about before,
yes,
is an Aramaic term which literally means things trusted in.
Right.
So
right.
It would include money, but it also includes possessions and other things that we would put our trust in beyond God.
And aren't we straight back to idols in Jeremiah?
Right. Yes, exactly. So here is the issue that Jesus has got, is that are we going to hold on to the things, or are we going to let the things serve good?
Yes.
Because when they're in my possession, they're serving me. Maybe the truth of the reality is, because they are idols, I'm actually serving it. But if I have them in my possession, that's fine, so long as they're being used for the good of all. And I guess this is part of the, the idea of what it means to be, for me, a Benedictine monk, in that we, even though my community is dispersed right across the world, we still hold all things in common. We still contribute financially to the life of our mother house and to our community. And we are expected to exercise in our everyday life this very activity of knowing that we have things not just for, to sit there and enjoy for ourselves, or there's nothing wrong with that, but in the moment somebody needs that we would be the first to say, you can have mine, or you can use mine. That we don't have, as you know from your reading of the Rule of St. Benedict, Benedict's very strong about the fact that monks don't have ownership. And even though I have things in my possession, I need to keep that in mind, that I have things that and it's a really interesting nuance, but I have things that I'm in possession of, but I don't own them.
Yeah.
And I have to be willing to let those things pass through my fingers to others. And I've actually been challenged on this by people who have said, have you ever done this? All the time. How far have you gone? To the point where my motorcycle was used by somebody else for 6 years. I gave my Harley Davidson to a friend of mine to use for 6 years. And he only recently, in the last couple of years, gave it back. Because he was traveling overseas moving to live overseas. And he said, thank you, but my season of needing to use it is over. You use your motorcycle. So, and I don't say that to boast. What I say is that this is something that we can do and take seriously. Now, of course, there's going to be situations where it's going to be hard to do that.
Mm.
Both you and I know the pain of lending a book to somebody and never seeing it again. I don't know. There's some books I've
or getting it back trashed.
Yeah. Yes. That's exactly right. So, there's that hesitance, with some things, and it's different things for different people.
Mm.
But Jesus is gently reminding us here and not about not having idols, but allowing everything that we have to be a blessing to God. And how do we love God? We love God by loving our neighbor.
Yeah.
And this is really what this is about.
Yeah. I really I really understand the pain you talk about as we hold our possessions loosely. And at the same time, there's this other element of me that recognizes this as just the nature of things. This is just the way it is. We love the idea that we own. We love the idea that this is mine. But everything, including us, is passing. So, we 2 weeks ago buried my father-in-law. Well, we buried him last week. He passed away 2 weeks ago. 96 years old. We've always, for 50 odd years, we looked at his house and we thought of it as his possession. But we all knew there was coming a time where he would have to let go of that, whether he liked it or not. And it would become someone else's. It's actually the only possibility. All we're being asked here is to embrace reality. And this is where I think the monks are really insightful when they say we don't possess anything, but they can still be given a book, use it for a time, and pass it on. But that's the only possibility with anything. It's the only possibility with the gift of life, is that it passes from us. And it's just the nature of everything. This is not Jesus saying, I want you to buck the system. It's actually saying, I want you to embrace the real system.
And this is the system.
I want you to embrace I want you to fix the broken system that you're embracing by admitting that you own nothing, that nothing is yours on a permanent, always basis. You may have use of something for a moment at best. But that is just the nature of things. And I take that question into all my reading of Jesus nowadays, because I think it's very consistently, you can look at the teachings of Jesus, and the Sermon on the Mount is classic on this. You can look at the teachings of Jesus, and Jesus is just telling us how it is. He's not giving us another list of rules and laws in the Sermon on the Mount. He is just explaining the nature of reality.
Yeah, that's exactly right, which is interesting you should say that, because it's a beautiful caveat into 1 Timothy, which I mentioned.
Good.
Which I mentioned is another literal, and this is how this works in practical terms. So right there, right from the beginning of 1 Timothy chapter 2, Paul writes, I urge then, first of all, that requests, prayers, intercessions, and thanksgiving be made for everyone, for kings and all those in authority, that we may live peaceful and quiet lives in all godliness and holiness. This is good and pleases God, our Savior, who wants all to be saved. Side aside, saved there, of course, means to be made whole.
Yes.
Right.
Healed.
So we want all people.
Same word used in.
That's right.
Same word used in the healing stories.
That's right. So we want all people to be made whole, to be healed, and to come to a knowledge of the truth. And so this is literally Paul spelling out to Timothy, this is the task. The task is to bring wholeness to everyone.
Yeah.
And how do we bring wholeness to everyone? Well, first of all, we will petition leaders to make sure they keep everyone in mind when they're making decisions. That's part of our task. But alongside that is for us to go and live our lives in all goodness, all godliness and holiness. And what does that look like? It's not piety. You know, Jesus said that we are to live righteous lives, and that word righteous is literally justice. And how do we bring justice? Well, justice is about bringing some sense of balance and equality as best we can back to the community. And how do we do that? Well, if my brother needs a shirt and I've got two, give him one. It goes back to what John said in, when people were saying, well, how do I get saved? How do I be made whole? Don't cheat people. Give someone a shirt when they've got two. This is Jesus talking about in the Sermon on the Mount, talking about, if you someone who's got two tunics, give me a cloak, or someone needs a tunic, give me a cloak as well. This is Jesus in the parable of the sheep and the goats, saying, when I was hungry, gave me something to eat. When I was thirsty, gave me something to drink. This is literally the work that we're called to do, to use what we have to be a blessing to others. And it really doesn't get more simple than that. The complexities that we have placed on living out the teachings of Jesus are, to put it in the context of the things we've been talking about today, are literally idols if they take us away from the task at hand. And I think most people, or hopefully there's quite a few out there, who would say that, yeah, exactly, my spiritual practice isn't just about me. It's about moving me and preparing me for a platform on which I can stand up then and go and give practical, loving support to others. That's why I pray. That's why I attend church. That's why I read scripture. That's why I meditate. That's why I give financially or in kind, or that's why I volunteer, or that's why I go bushwalking, or whatever it happens to be for you that puts you into that state where you are reminded of that connectedness with the Creator and all things. But if it doesn't move us to love others, and if it doesn't move us to live those lives of holiness by bringing peace and love to all, then we've totally missed the point on what it's about. This is the core of Jesus' teaching in the gospel. This is the core of who we are as being created in the image of God. And it's all the way through. And once you see it, like in verses like this, passages like this, which I've heard preached on in some of the most incredibly weird and wonderful ways. Everything from, this is why we have to put the flag in the sanctuary of our church, because it's all about praying for kings and those in authority, and therefore we need to make sure that we have particular people as prime minister or whatever. And come on, no, this is about making sure that balance is a part of our society. That's why we petition those in leadership. That's why we petition those in power, to say, bring it back. This is why at the point of recording this is why we need more Christians out there who are saying to these mega wealthy business owners, why are you still treating your employees so poorly in the way you pay them? We are the ones who should be petitioning government, saying, why are you not raising the standard of living for those who are unable to look after themselves, or who have found themselves in trouble for a season? And we have so many people living below the poverty line in this country, both who are employed and unemployed. It's ridiculous. And it beggars belief that we continue to support, or that, generally speaking now, that those in power, both in government and in big business, are continually supporting each other. We're bailing out big businesses all the time. Why? Because it doesn't seem like those bailouts are supporting the people who are allowing those people who are at the top to continue to be mega wealthy. It doesn't make sense. and we're called to use what we have to bring that balance back. We live a very practical faith, and we kid ourselves if we think that Christianity, or any other religion for that matter, is this esoteric, separated from reality. And if you're living a faith that's like that, then you've completely missed the point. And this is why I know people, I mean, obviously I'm not, I'm a Benedictine monk, but I'm not living out a Benedictine lifestyle in the form that most traditional Benedictines would, although our order is still very, it's kosher, it's very bona fide. But, even cloistered monks and nuns, though, do amazing service for the communities that are around them. And a lot of what they do helps to feed the poor, even though they might not leave. I mean, the Carthusians, who are basically hermits who live in community, but by themselves in community, if that makes sense. They see each other a couple of times a day, and they celebrate once a week. They have lunch, and then they have some interaction together. But that's it. The rest of the week, they're pretty much on their own, except when they're saying prayers in chapel once or twice a day, and then they're back to their cell where they work around their community and stuff like that. But it's complete silence. There's very little interaction, and yet a lot of what they provide as a community, a lot of the food that they grow, a lot of the bread that they bake, a lot of the stuff that they produce goes, and a lot of the income that they make from that goes to supporting poor people in their local area. So it's a very practical outworking of living in a particular way. It's certainly not selfish, as a lot of people often would say of people who are living in religious life. And so we who are not living like that, if these people who are cloistered to that degree can still serve their local community and give of what they have, both in produce and money, to support the people of their area, how much more are we in our locations called to do just that? And both the gospel reading and what Paul's saying, and in essence what we've seen in Jeremiah and the Psalm too, pull very, very powerfully on those things. And I think that's something that could emerge as a great theme out of these passages of scripture this coming week.
Yeah. That's interesting. You talk about petitioning governments, using the power that we have for the sake of a peaceful community, a balanced shalom kind of community. And the temptation for us to abuse that as though, and take sides, pretend God is for one party and not for the other. All of that in the context here of, how much power does the Apostle Paul have in the face of the Roman Empire? He doesn't have some inherent rights to, bring his objections. He is a Roman citizen, to be fair, but that doesn't mean he has the right to protest in the sense that we have in our time. In fact, the only right he appeals to here really is prayer, is dependence on God.
Yeah.
I love the humility that sits there. He's asking for the best for kings and those in authority. This is not because that's returned to Paul by these people. Paul is, Paul is nothing. He's just someone who's in the way to a lot of these authorities, and his message is considered dangerous. So here is, and I want to say this, here is Paul praying for his enemies, not just for those who are part of my town, part of my community, for the good governor who lives just down the road and has served us well for all of these years. This is Paul asking an oppressed people to pray for their enemies. And I think that's a big deal. And it's one of those, this is one of those passages where the rubber hits the road for the early Christian community. will you pray for those who crucified your ancestors?
Yeah.
Will you pray for them that they will be saved and come to a knowledge of the truth? So this is not just praying that I'll live a peaceful life. This is praying that the gospel will infiltrate my enemies.
Yeah.
Which you can see how this this gospel message is radically different to the heart of the psalmist we've looked at before, in Psalm 79 just earlier. This guy who wants compassion for me but not for my enemies. This is actually a passage that's saying God's grace for all. And I want you to pray for it. Perhaps in the knowledge that prayer changes us rather than God.
It's a really interesting thought. I mean, we've just come out as we record this and it goes to air. It's September 2022 here in Australia, or everywhere in the world actually. But we just had an election not so long ago, and we saw a change of government. Now, I'm not saying this to get into political debates, but it's very easy to see that there were some Christian people who were very strongly for our previous government, to the point where those same Christian people are perhaps quite angry and disappointed that that particular government lost the election, and are possibly praying that there is a restatement of that government come the election in 3 years' time. On the other hand, you have some people who would have been praying that this government was lost, got out of power, and that the government we now have is the one that we should have there, and is praying that those people stay. But what we've been talking about here is a very different way of viewing this, and very different way of viewing politics. I know in America it's even more divisive,
of course,
in terms of that,
yes,
than it is here in Australia. But what we're talking about here is a completely different approach. And this is an approach that says we are going to hold the government of the day, whoever that is, to account for the good of our communities.
Yeah.
And so that it doesn't matter for me whether the government that's in power is Liberal or Labor or National or Green or whatever. My job, according to what we've been talking about and reading about today, is to look at my community and say who's hurting, who is struggling, who needs support, and to go to those who are in power and to say, politics aside, whether I agree with your politics and your whatever, these people are hurting. Are you going to do something about this? Are we going to change this? Are we going to, support these people? And if not, why not? And to do something about bringing about that change, even to the point of where there are some things we're just going to have to do ourselves, because the government won't get behind it. And so this is a really different way of looking at it, because traditionally we've always thought about this as you have to pick a political side. But what I hear you saying, and what we're sort of getting from the readings today, is that we don't get to pick sides. What we do is we get to pick the people who are around us. That's the side whose side we take.
Yeah.
And that our task is to support them and to love them. And part of that loving means saying to a government that we may have helped elect and saying, you're letting the team down. This needs to change. To go into the businesses that we may even have at one time or even currently support, and saying, you are letting everybody down. You need to change. And being that voice that Jesus was. Like you say, we pray for those in power because they're in power, not because they're the best or the worst or whatever else, but because we want them to be wise. We want them to make good decisions, not just for us or for them, but for everyone. And that's seemingly, to me, it seems like people are finding that harder and harder and harder to do. Probably because there are people who've got very vested interests in what's going on, and that those in power feel the need to have to support them. Call them shareholders, call them investors, call them donors, call them what you want. That seems to be who the most important person in the world is to a lot of the people who are in power in our world today. As we're recording this, the world is still talking about and mourning the death of Queen Elizabeth II, who I noted on the morning after she passed away on social media, the messages of love and condolences and grief and stories of great, joy at what she did and how she did it. It didn't matter if you were in a Commonwealth country or a non-Commonwealth country. It didn't matter where in the world you lived or what your politics were. We were talking about a woman who led for 70 something years, just 70th year, wasn't it, this year?
70th year this year. Yep.
Yeah, so 70 years, this woman worked in this position, the world's oldest and longest serving public servant. And someone say, well, some public servant, look at the way she lived. But you know what? If you look at the things that woman did, and sure, she made mistakes and did things wrong, but boy, she did a lot of good. How good? So good that the day that she dies, the whole world seems to come together in wanting to pay respects. And that says volumes. You don't see that a lot in our leaders today, people who are so benevolent and giving of their time and what they do have to different things and different causes and different, rights and stuff around the world. They don't draw that sort of support. And so there in itself is a great example of it can be done. And the question is where it's not being done, are we going to, as Paul beckons Timothy to here, stand up and seek that goodness and wholeness for the world around us? Because that's what God wants. That's how God wants us to live. Literally, live peaceful and quiet lives in godliness and holiness. This is good, and this is what pleases God.
A remarkable goal for government is being presented here. It's actually a call for, if the government gets it right, if leadership gets it right, we live peaceful, we live in freedom. It's the government that gets it wrong that oppresses, that has to oppress to hold on to power. But the one who gets it right often is saying less rather than more, having less direct impact on the lives of people, but are actually allowing for their freedom. And I think I saw something of that in Queen Elizabeth II. I think she wasn't quick to argue a case. She wasn't quick to defend ground. She was a listener to the people, and I think that kept her in favour, unlike anyone else over the last 70 years.
Well, it's being a shrewd manager.
Yes, it is. Absolutely. Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Yes. And interestingly enough, I thought of her as we described the simple reality that we can keep nothing. Here is the richest person on the planet, and she can keep nothing. She owns nothing today.
I was just going to say, technically, well, not even today, as it was before she died.
Yeah.
But even when she was alive, yes, she was the richest woman in the world, but she literally owned nothing. It belongs to the people.
Yes.
This is the sort of stuff you learn.
It's her privilege to have it pass through her hands for these 70 years.
Yeah.
And then it's gone.
and still
It is not
literally,
part of the essence of who she is.
she
Yeah.
can't take it with her.
Yeah.
And even if she could, it literally doesn't belong to the royal family.
Yes.
It
Yes, that's right.
literally belongs to the people of
Yes.
Great Britain,
Yeah.
such as the things you learn when you have a British citizen for a
Which
wife.
is the case for all of us. That
Yes, and
is the
that's the
case
important
for
point.
all of us. Yeah.
Yeah, indeed.
From the stories I know of the Queen, and I'm not claiming to know lots of them, she was not only the wealthiest person in the world, but lived very, very simply, and was quite frugal in her spending. I love that. There's something very special about this person that I think our time could learn of, and it might be a very, very apt season for us. I'm assuming over the next weeks, months, years, we will learn more and more about who she really was. And I think she has plenty to teach us still.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, the 15th Sunday after Pentecost, Jeremiah chapter 8, verse 18 to 9, verse 1, Psalm 79, verses 1 to 9, 1 Timothy 2, verses 1 to 7, and Luke 16, verses 1 to 13. Of course, all those passages are in the bit down below if you're on YouTube, or in the show notes if you're listening via podcast. And of course, please join the conversation. What are you learning? What did you hear? What did you preach on? Please send us a note at between2, that's the number 2, Sundays @gmail.com. Comment on Mark's posts at barefootfollower.life. Pop over and drop a DM or a comment at monkindocs at Instagram. We would love to connect with you. And of course, both in the show notes on YouTube and on the podcast, you will find a link tree which has links to all those things and more. So thank you again for being here. Another great bunch of passages. Again, so much to chew on here.
Yeah. There's plenty for us to think on for a week.
I think so. I think so. So until then, next week when we chew on these things again, thanks for being with us, Mark. Thanks again.
Great to see you, mate.
You too, buddy.
You enjoy your week.
Yeah, you too. And we'll catch you all next week for another Between Two Sundays. Until then, bye for now.
Bye.